Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, today's discussion will focus on African institutions and the growth of African economies and how we can move away from reliance on bailouts and towards real growth, especially in these difficult days of COVID-19. What needs to happen? Now, joining me on Zoom to delve into this is Economist Duma Gqubule from the Center of Economic Development Studies. Thank you very much, Duma, for joining me. It's a question a lot of people are asking. What is going to happen in 6 months' time when all these support funds and stimulus packages have run out and there's a lot of money to be paid back and people haven't got the money to do so?
Yes, Chris. I think Africa and the rest of the world has been hit by what I would call the biggest shock in about a century. And what we must realize is that all countries have been hit by a similar shock, which should result in a decline in GDP growth and a decline in tax collection by many governments throughout the world, and a consequent increase in the debt to GDP ratios. But I think the challenge for African countries is to find innovative ways of, we're going to be in the same situation as everybody else in the world. So before we panic, we should realize that in relative terms, we started this crisis without extremely high debt to GDP ratios for the African continent, including South Africa. And afterwards, we will still not be in a situation like many other countries. But it does, although there are some countries that are debt stressed on our continent, I should say so. But I think we have to find innovative ways of mobilizing African domestic savings to build this infrastructure that we need for the recovery. So there's two types of response that we need, because our responses as African countries on the economic side has been not as robust as we have in terms of other regions in the world, especially the developed countries. So we have to find creative ways of mobilizing domestic finance to support incomes, households and firms, and also to drive the recovery through infrastructure. So those are the two challenges that we face: to reorientate our institutions to be able to support these two imperatives in terms of stabilizing the economy through incomes and financing the recovery through infrastructure.
Thereby hangs one of the problems there. You say about mobilizing savings and mobilizing domestic funds. This country here, South Africa, has got one of the lowest levels of savings in the world. How is that going to happen?
Well, I've been saying a lot in South Africa that we should look at our whole balance sheet, national balance sheet. So, for example, we've got assets of about 1.92 trillion in our public sector pension fund. And I remember back in the day, former President Thabo Mbeki met in Libya with African leaders, and they were working on an initiative to mobilize African state pension funds to become more involved in terms of financing and economic development. And I've traveled in East Africa, and I've seen many housing flats that are financed by the pension funds, I think in Tanzania where I was once. So what am I saying? There are innovative ways of financing this, mobilizing domestic resources. In South Africa, we also have we've got surpluses. If we look at the whole balance sheet, we've got relatively high foreign exchange reserves. We've got surpluses in our unemployment insurance fund, and I'm sure in many African countries, if we think creatively, we can mobilize domestic sources for our investment. But obviously, that doesn't mean that we mustn't look elsewhere. But I do believe that the priority should be domestic resource mobilization. And even within the South African context, I believe that with a more aggressive response from, for example, our central bank, our pension fund, to put more of our funds towards our economic development, we can make a big difference in terms of the financing the development of this and the financing the recovery of this continent after this crisis is over. Let me just mention that, for example, the Development Bank of South Africa, the Industrial Development Corporation, in the South African context, these are well-run institutions. And I was looking at, they haven't been tainted by recent allegations that many Africans are seeing about state capture. And I was reading today that the Development Bank of South Africa, it's had unqualified audits since inception and so forth. So these are relatively well-run organizations. So I think we should be providing them with more resources to be able to finance the recovery of the African continent. And the DBSA, for example, has got about 25% of its loan book in the rest of the continent. I would like to see this organization being recapitalized and by the government of South Africa and the central bank to be able to support a bigger push towards the recovery of our country and the rest of the continent.
Now, just pick up on a point you mentioned there. You said perhaps also Africa, as well as looking at domestic savings, should be looking elsewhere to try and get this money in. And there's an estimated $100 trillion managed by institutional investors and commercial banks around the world. Certainly we could do with on this continent. But surely at this particular time, a lot of these institutions are also looking at the risks, which are great. They're looking to batten down the hatches. How can that be approached?
You know, Chris, I think as developing countries, especially African countries, we also have to be wary about looking out elsewhere, because you must remember that the original sin of borrowing in foreign currency, it has been the reason for about almost every emerging market currency crisis since the early 80s in Mexico, and that spread to the rest of the world. And so I think we have to be really careful about going into, you saw the Eurobond issues that we've had in Africa. I mean, they don't help us to build protection against all these crises in global capitalism. So I do think we have to find creative ways of mobilizing our domestic finance towards financing these the massive challenges that we're faced with in our continent.
And one of these is financing mechanisms, which you're advocating to try to implement to sort out our dearth of money. How exactly would those work?
Chris, you know that we've got one institution, the African Development Bank. I'm not sure, I haven't looked at it lately, but I'm not sure that it's large enough to be able to support something of this initiative. So I'd rather that the African Development Bank does the exposure towards the foreign currency and protects the African countries and finds innovative ways of financing it, perhaps in domestic currencies. And, you know, so I'm not sure how it would work, but I definitely think that we have to look towards our domestic sources of growth. And there has to be collaboration between the different development finance institutions on the continent in East, West, North, and West Africa, and perhaps find mechanisms to raise more finance for this. What we need is a massive push towards revitalizing our economies after this crisis.
And clearly, it would help if a lot of companies here in Africa, and particularly here in South Africa, a lot of companies have done okay in these very difficult days of COVID-19. They've got healthy balance sheets. How is it possible that the nation can get in and unlock these balance sheets and get them to invest and money once again in the economy that's their lifeblood?
You know, Chris, the biggest challenges in terms of infrastructure, if you look at the analysis, is energy and transport in the continent. And many of the energy companies are still state-owned, so we can find ways of, our one has got a debt crisis, and I believe that the government should find a way to address the balance sheet constraints at Eskom and some of the operational challenges, because Eskom should be having a major role to play in terms of the solutions towards energy on our continent, despite the situation that it's in, and also in transport. Transnet, although it was implicated through allegations of state capture, it's also got a relatively better balance sheet to be able to support the transport backlogs on our continent. So I believe that if we can find a way of financing the energy and the transport, which is the biggest portion of that 170 billion rands or $150 billion that you're talking about, infrastructure annual backlogs, then I think we should talk about it through sectors as well. Yeah.
And also you mentioned infrastructure there, which is another issue altogether. There's a huge gap on this continent for infrastructure, which would help to aid economic growth. But again, I'm sure a lot of infrastructure projects are being put back or put on hold right now just because people aren't really sure what's going on.
Yes, yes. So I think that the central banks of many African countries, they must support their state-owned energy producers to be able to be more resilient, to be able to finance these the building of the infrastructure in terms of energy, and the same with the transport parastatals. In South Africa, for example, I believe that if our central bank had to support Eskom together with the state pension fund, provide more support. There are proposals that have come from union leaders as to how we can support this to make it more solvent than the situation that this is in now, and address some of its operational issues. And as I said earlier on, Transnet is also in a very good position to be able to participate in many of the transport infrastructure projects in rail, in ports and so forth. Yeah. So I do think we have to have partnerships between African countries to develop the infrastructure in these areas.
How is that going to work? I mean, often government projects can be very difficult to get on the road, and when you've got a project with several governments involved, it can be even more difficult. How is that going to work?
Well, obviously, you need the state to step in through the development finance agencies to be able to make these projects more viable, and through some kind of funding, and then you can bring in foreign funders as well to be involved in these port projects and the rail projects and the energy projects. And so I do think that you need the state to lead the way and provide some of the initial funding through the state, the development finance institutions, and so forth. And then that will attract or crowd in other investors to join in these projects. But it must be on terms that are favorable for African countries, and not through terms that are, and also the African Development Bank and so forth, they can get involved in terms of these projects, and they are very involved in projects.
And there's a lot of talk these days about the blending of private and public money to get these things done. I mean, on paper it sounds like a great idea, but it's not always that easy, is it? How difficult can it be sometimes to crack these deals for infrastructure by the blending of private and public money?
Yes, that's what I was talking about. So the blending of public and private funding, it requires, different institutions, different layers of funding, and so forth, to be able to put these projects together. And so I think the DBSA, South Africa's got some sort of expertise in this area, and they should share their expertise with other African countries in terms of project preparation. And I'm sure the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, and some of our parastatals, which are these are very efficient parastatals in South Africa, they can find a way of supporting them in terms of different. We need to have a SA Inc. approach, whereby the state-owned companies and the government and the private sector become involved in developing these projects. For example, let's say there's a construction project, let's say rail. I went to some of the rail companies in Zimbabwe, and it's a desperate situation, but I can't see why the government can't provide some of the initial seed funding for project preparation, and then the DBSA, the IDC, and other institutions can't be involved, and South African private sector companies can't be involved in building the infrastructure that we need. For example, the North-South Rail project, and some of these iconic projects that we've been talking about for many years on the African continent here.
Another thing that's been talked about in this issue is this so-called Global Structural Transformation Fund. I mean, it sounds great, everyone chipping in to help build infrastructure, but how practical is that?
Well, I think it's something that we should look at. And I said many years ago, there was a similar initiative to mobilize domestic finance under the previous president of South Africa. And I think we should find a way to meet together within the African Union towards Agenda 2063 and find what are the sources that we can mobilize in terms of our domestic resources, and how can we allocate the resources towards the major infrastructure projects that we need. Because as you know, levels of electrification in many countries are still very low. And the transport links, despite gains that have been made in the recent years, the transport links are very poor. So we need that infrastructure to be able to, that there can be trade between African countries, and that the conditions to trade infrastructure will unlock the opportunities for us to trade with each other. And I was talking about the rail links with us and the rest of the continent. There is no reason why we can't have, we should, this North-South rail project that we've been talking about for a long time, we should get that. These are some of the catalytic investment projects that we can be doing in the continent. And we have to look at our SADC in our region. There's also the gas projects in Mozambique and so forth. So there's a lot of infrastructure projects, the hydroelectric that we've been talking about for many years in the DRC. I don't know what, we should be talking about these catalytic projects that can be drive our recovery from this disaster of the depression in 2020.
Well, there's one of my pet subjects. I spent a lot of years reporting from Mozambique, and this gas boom promises so much for what was once one of the poorest nations in the world. But the one thing that concerns me is that how the investment is going to be funneled into Mozambique. There's so much that needs to be built: schools, colleges, roads, houses, everything to try to support the gas boom. How can a country like that get the finance together?
Chris, I've been a big believer that, South Africa has to play a bigger role in terms of the development of the region. Because, if you look at issues of migration, if you look at South Africa, the three major waves of migration we've seen over the last 20 years have been because of instability in our region, for example, in Mozambique, and before that in DRC and Zimbabwe. So I believe that a lot of the migration we've seen into South Africa has been because of instability in other countries in our region. And I would say, quite frankly, foreign policy failures on our behalf. And I can't understand why South Africa is not getting more involved in addressing the issues in Zimbabwe. And we've seen the issue with the journalists being detained and the preacher and so forth. This policy that we need to get involved in the rebuilding the economies in our region first before we move out further. And I do believe that the one in Mozambique, there's many projects in Mozambique. We should be providing them with budget support. They've got a very high debt to GDP ratio, but it is in our interest as South Africa to become more involved in the development of infrastructure on the continent.
I mean, sure, Duma, what you're saying makes economic sense, but as I also spent many years working in Zimbabwe as a journalist, and you're into deep waters there, I think, because often, despite the willingness of the economy in South Africa to aid other countries in the region, sometimes there's that accusation, political accusation albeit, of being big brother and interfering in neighbouring states. I mean, do you think that Africa's coming to that point there where perhaps we're trying to get over all that kind of feeling?
You know what, Chris, my view is that we can provide support to the Zimbabweans, but it must be obviously under certain conditions in terms of the democracy that they must have, the political situation. And I know that we've got this overused term that we've tried to support, government of national unity, which we believe should work in every situation, but shouldn't necessarily. But we need to have a way of solving the political and economic challenges of Zimbabwe. It is a desperate situation. It's a humanitarian disaster, and it's a human rights disaster. There's so many disasters all rolled into one. And I don't understand why we as SADC first, South Africa first, SADC the regions, because all the regions have seen migration away from Zimbabwe to their countries. And it's in our interest to be able to solve this intractable problem in our region. Yes, that's what I think we should do. Yeah. And then obviously there's other issues like in Mozambique and Angola that we have to be involved with as a country. But I do believe that the priority right now in Southern Africa has to be rebuilding this economy of Zimbabwe. And I also am very close to it because part of my family is in Zimbabwe. And I really do think that we have to, as South Africans, take this more seriously. And all our institutions, our construction companies, our state-owned companies must be involved in this situation. And our politicians, and we must find a political settlements to the situation, the unacceptable the political situation that is not being solved. Yeah, so that's what I believe we should do.
But what is it going to take, though, you think? I mean, if you look back at the history of the last 20 years, back to Thabo Mbeki you were mentioning, he used to talk about quiet diplomacy. A lot of people during that time said, well, people are still hungry. It doesn't matter what kind of diplomacy you've got. But also, just talking, I remember doing a story 25 years ago saying the South African government was concerned about the number of Zimbabweans getting lost in the system down here, jumping the border. And they reckon it was maybe 60,000 a year. I mean, how many people since then But again, what is the solution? It seems that Thabo Mbeki couldn't solve it very easily. A lot of governments grapple with it. What is the solution to help a country like Zimbabwe that needs economic help right now?
Well, we were very involved in the political settlement in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think maybe we've got lessons from that situation that we could apply to countries in our region like Zimbabwe. And I just think that, Chris, I just think that we haven't thought about it. We haven't applied our minds to this thing. And I think it's not the priority of South African politicians right now, but I really think it should be the priority. And I just think it starts off with civil society demanding that South Africa must get involved in the situation in Zimbabwe. We cannot just fold our arms while our African brothers are suffering so much in our neighboring countries, in Zimbabwe and so forth. Yeah. So I just think that we have to reimagine this region over the next 5-10 years as to what it's going to look like and what is the economic. We can't grow our economies with this neighbor of ours that is in such a desperate situation. So so I'm a big believer in regional integration and intra-regional trade and so forth. Yeah.
But then again, that's another big problem. I think one of the casualties of COVID-19 has been this outward-looking attitude towards life. Unfortunately, whether we like it or not, a lot of countries around the world, from South Africa to the United States to Europe, are going to be looking in the post-COVID-19 world and think not only charity begins at home, but also investment and economic assistance begins at home. I think it's going to be a very difficult world we're going to be in. In that, how can we deal with situations like Zimbabwe and Africa?
Yes, you're correct in the sense that I think foreign direct investment will decrease, trade flows will decrease, and everybody will be looking domestically to drive the economy. So I think it will be no different in Africa. We have to tap all our domestic resources and resilience and creativity to develop ways to fund our economy. And you must remember that Asia, when they developed their countries many decades ago, it was driven by domestic investment primarily, and then foreign investors followed later. So we can't expect foreign investment to lead the recovery of Africa's economy. It can only be the icing on the cake. So there is, unfortunately, it's going to be more difficult in the post-COVID era to attract those flows of investment, of trade and so forth. So we have to look inward. How can we stimulate our economies? How can we build trade amongst ourselves through the free trade agreement and so forth? Yeah.
And then again, we've been speaking a lot of gloomy stuff in the last half an hour about the COVID world. But what kind of inspiration do you think Africa can take from another country north of where we are now to the east of the continent, Rwanda? I mean, you've got a country there that just 20 years ago started virtually from scratch, from ground zero, and built an economy. Looking at their economy, what do you think the rest of the continent can learn from them in these difficult times?
Rwanda's had an excellent response to the COVID crisis. And if you look at their numbers, their infections and so forth, and I was reading recently about what they've done in terms of isolation, creating facilities for people to be isolated, the testing, the tracing, and so forth, and the non-pharmaceutical intervention. So I think we've got a lot of lessons to learn from Rwanda as Africans, and also another country that's done very well in this situation is Ethiopia as well, in terms of their response to the pandemic. So Mauritius as well. So I think we should learn from these countries as to what they've done. And Ethiopia has been one of the fastest growing countries on our continent, and Rwanda as well, and much of East Africa as well has been doing very well, and countries like Mauritius. So we should share what we've seen, Chris, pre-COVID, is that there were primarily the situation, the African growth story was continuing in many countries, but the problem was that some countries, the largest countries, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, were bringing the averages down. But many of the countries were doing well before the COVID disaster.
So, as I say, we're getting near to the end of the show now. Usually the time in these days of COVID-19, we try to look for a little bit more hope than we've been talking about. The overall picture, we're looking ahead now. Still a lot of people not sure what's going to happen in this continent when it comes to investment and infrastructure. But looking ahead, well, what are the hopeful bright spots you can see on the horizon?
I think in South Africa, we've seen a lot of public-private collaboration. It hasn't yielded results yet, but we're seeing it in an institution called NEDLAC. We've seen a number of growth plans come up from the business, from the ANC, and many people. I just, the positive thing I should think is that I believe that we should have a genuine social compact between all stakeholders in South Africa, not the ones that we tried to do in the past, where there were certain issues around economic policy that could not be discussed. So I believe that South Africa, we're about 20% of the GDP on the continent, slightly less, and we have a role to play, and we have to get our house in order, and we have to unite as South Africans to develop, to build this, to recover from this situation of the COVID situation.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Duma Gqubule from the Centre of Economic Development Studies, and that was this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. From me, Chris Bishop, and the team here, it's goodbye.